Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh. Welcome again to another episode of Encounters, where we have ordinary conversations with extraordinary people. Today, it's my pleasure to introduce you to a lady called Simarjit Kaur from Southall. She works as an activist and a in-the-field therapist for torture victims as part of the Taran Project. Welcome.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Glad to have you here. To begin with, just explain to us how you got into this Taran Project and your involvement with it, where it all began.
Well, Paji, just like a lot of people, in the 80s and 90s, I thought that a lot of victims had been helped. I didn't realise that there had been very little overseas aid directly from, I don't think there was any actually from the UK government via India.
So you were aware there were victims, you were aware something had happened? I was aware there was
victims, but just like a lot of people, I assumed something had been done.
Were you aware of what had happened? What had happened?
Yes, we were definitely aware when 1984 happened,
right.
In terms of the genocide, Amritsar massacre and the Delhi massacre.
Operation Blue Star
and that the media reported. But after that, there was no community media. So unless you were a Punjabi speaker, it's not an excuse, but I have to be honest,
yeah.
But unless you were a Punjabi reader, rather, slowly, bit by bit, you lost information that was being explained to in the gurdwaras, as to what was happening to Sikhs there.
Yeah.
And that now that it was a police state or what was actually happening, month by month to Sikhs.
Yeah.
Because the gurdwaras were being so heavily monitored. And then they neutralised themselves.
British Gurdwaras were being monitored.
British Gurdwaras, and they were neutralising themselves further and further and saying that the place of worship is not a place for information. However, as we know traditionally, the Sikhs have always gathered in terms of meedi-beedi, political activism, different bungas, different talents came together.
Different dals.
So the Gurdwara was actually a place for people to actually meet and make things happen for the outside world in terms of human rights. And that was our religion.
In terms of media, there was the Des Pradesh, but like you say, Punjabi speaking or reading.
Yeah.
There was the Des Pradesh Punjab Times. Awaz-e-Qawm was created, I think, for that purpose.
So it was quite a shock for me to one day wake up and suddenly realise that in the 90s, the Sikhs had gone through huge extrajudicial killings. And as I went back to Punjab, I basically contacted human rights activists bit by bit.
Was that your purpose for going back to Punjab, or was it just a holiday?
Do you know what? It was a personal reason I had to go back. My mother had passed away,
right.
So I had to physically go back to take her ashes. Yep. And when I went back, it was also the time, I went back and forth once or twice. And around this time, Professor Buller had gone on to death row.
Right.
And so gradually, bit by bit, having conversations with human rights activists in Punjab, I went with the Committee for Coordination of Disappearances in Punjab, the CCDP.
Yep.
So the CCDP, Gurtej Singh had opened up his house. All the Punjab human rights groups that had been very viciously attacked in the 90s, basically the Punjab Human Rights Organisations, directors' son was killed, Atamjit Singh. All of these groups.
Just this Ajit Singh Bains' son?
No, it was another PHRO director at the time.
Right.
And so they had been very, very criminalised, marginalised,
Well, he was arrested
victimised.
himself, wasn't he?
Yeah, and Justice Bains.
80-year-old?
He's 80 years old, and he was like considered the people's judge. He had basically made a huge stand in terms of human rights. And so eventually, once the war ended in 94, the Punjab human rights groups all came together. So did the Khalistan political groups,
right.
Various groups under Maan and anybody else who was about.
The non-fighting factions.
The non-fighting factions came together,
yeah.
and that is how the CCDP formed.
Right.
The majority of its findings was to go back over what the Kalra findings were. Jaswant Singh Kalra had died for. And a lot of activists had died. You had Ram Singh Billing, he was a journalist, Jagvinder Singh, journalist. So a lot of the human rights community had become paralysed in the 90s. So just after the end of the Civil War, you actually have the human rights community trying to come together and in a very dire state of impunity, trying to go back over where the victims actually are.
So how long did it take you to figure out all this?
So the community
from the beginning of realising there's an issue and to the point where you realised that no one's helping, what did you think? What did you assume that you could bring to the situation in terms of a solution?
It's a very good question. I didn't think I could do anything because I think what happens first of all is when you're going into the field, as I went with the CCDP reporters and Amrik Singh Muktsar, is that they would look at 4 victims in a day, 5, and you'd sit with these lawyers.
No, when I say victims, when I say your involvement with it, how did you even begin to liaise with CCDP?
So with the CCDP, the Punjab Human,
in essence, you were an individual.
The Punjab Human
from
Rights
England.
Community has always been very open. So once I'd heard of Justice Bains and all these sort of human rights activists,
I just googled them.
They were very they were saying no, we didn't have internet in those. It sort of it wasn't that obvious.
You personally
on
didn't
internet.
have internet
but,
access.
If you ended up going to Chandigarh, Ludhiana, you came across a human rights activist. They introduced you to other human rights activists.
Right, and
it was not a territorial time, which unfortunately, since then has human rights within the Sikhs has become very territorial, nor was it commercialized. So you would get to meet a lot of people.
Yeah.
But then once you went with the CCDP reporters into the field, what you realized was a lot of victims that the lawyers would be writing all their data down. How did somebody die? What happened then? But I just got this feeling after a few visits, I just thought, the lawyers are just going to write this down and one day these people might be helped. So I started to think that there must be a way that I can go back to a lot of people who have been victimized, mainly by the police state, because people who had been victimized by militants were being offered some sort of a pension by the Indian state. So I had to sort of really decide fast that there must be something I can do for these people.
Yeah.
So because
there's financial assistance for the victims of terror?
There is financial assistance for victims of terror who were terrorized by militants. Yep. So if they lost a family member.
Does that include black cats?
That includes black cats. Basically, there's no differentiation between
vigilante groups and actual militants and terror.
Yeah, I mean, that could be an interesting point of research for somebody in the future, but there hasn't been a differentiation in terms of victims. So what you found was that the state was ready to give them a pension. It wasn't a great pension. They were very poor people as well.
But it was assistance.
Who were hurt,
regardless.
Yes, by the militant violence. And at the same time, their next generation would possibly be offered jobs. Right. However, in terms of if your loved one was killed by the state, there was absolutely nothing, and perhaps a few drops managing to get through from foreign aid and foreign.
But no state pension and no state assistance.
No security of any sort.
No alleviation of suffering whatsoever.
So I had basically worked in a technology company as a strategist, and it was a nice job. I got a good redundancy. So I started to think, how can I make a very small amount of money really, really effective for these people? So the one thing I figured out...
That was your first thought on your own redundancy, your own personal money?
Yeah.
Right.
And the first thing I thought about was that the first thing poor people do is they'll cut back on their access to medicine, or they'll sort of skip over a scanning or something that's really important. Yeah. So I started to look at the area of medical access for victims.
Yep.
I researched quite a few groups when I got back to England. The usual ones like Médecins Sans Frontières, Physicians for Human Rights. MSF said they had sent a doctor into Kashmir, one to the Gujarat earthquake, and that was it. Yes. So I thought if you could do that as a global organization, I think we could do a little bit better. One of the human rights activists from the CCDP, Ashok Agarwal, he was a lovely guy, but he did warn me when I kept talking about doctors. He said doctors are very mercenary in India.
Indeed.
So they're very much like lawyers. They'll be after getting money. And then the more research we did, the more I figured out within months, it was only a few months of research, I figured out that a lot of torture victims were also being told by doctors that you could have XYZ operation. These were like scams, basically, to bleed poor people into giving more money.
Indeed, yeah.
And then quite a few widows would tell me that somebody had set up, say, an eye camp in XYZ Bind, and little lottery tickets were given out. And then when they'd get there, they were more or less told that everybody would have to pay. So I realised there were so many scams around the poor there were so many scams around medical aid. At that time, there were various groups, they were looking at foreign aid, they were looking at helping other countries. I did try and convince members of the Sikh community, and I tried to convince members of the foreign establishment, in terms of Médecins Sans Frontières, to work with us. And afterwards, I got some mentoring from Physicians for Human Rights USA.
Right.
I found one person who was very, very...
Physicians for Human Rights?
Yes.
Not prevention of torture?
Yeah, they basically look at torture victims around the world. And Physicians for Human Rights Denmark had done a report in 1998 about the Punjab Eyes Wide Shut torture in Punjab. Did you read that?
Indeed, yeah.
So I looked at the back and I contacted all the people. And what I found was... Yes,
just cold call them.
So what I wanted was really for an established aid agency to go in, because if you're trying to do aid work, you really need proper systems.
Well, a specialised medical team, basically.
And what I found was that they were put off by the Indian state, by their colleagues in the Indian state. We can't talk about the entire Indian state, but their colleagues in Chandigarh, they were put off from coming back. So then I realised...
by doctors?
Yes, they were doctors. So then I realised that also, the more I looked at torture victims and widows, I realised that there is a whole science around humanitarian work, and that people might write a PhD or a fantastic book, but still nobody's going to help these people, and time is moving on. So Physicians for Human Rights USA, Dr. Ayakapino, is the director of research, and he was a professor at Berkeley University. He was a fantastic door opener, and he basically gave me really good advice about getting medicines, getting simple, it could be a simple hernia operation for a widow, for a torture victim. And that was the start of helping a person who had been victimized. Rather than trying to find the specialists who were specialists in terms of torture rehabilitation from the West, which we did try and do as well, but they would take a long time. They might go on a sort of 1 week visit to Punjab, but they weren't.
$1 million question. Estimation, how many torture victims are there in Punjab?
It's a very good question, Baji. Nobody can answer that question. We can only go by how many people have been killed, and even that hasn't been established because of the paralysis.
Okay,
but
let me rephrase the question.
We could be looking at over 50,000 people in terms of physical torture.
Of torture survivors?
Of torture survivors. Because if a widower, as was the case for a lot of people, if a widower stood and her husband was being dragged away, then she was mentally tortured. So in actual fact, you could even... create
post-traumatic stress disorder.
There's a lot of people who suffered vicarious trauma, as well as being dragged in by the police, and they were very reluctant.
So there's mental torture as well as physical torture.
And women were very reluctant. What we found was, to this day, that the data in terms of what has happened to women is almost negligent, because
who compiles that data? What would be the source?
There were various sources, but a lot of the sources kept getting killed because of the early 90s extrajudicial killings and examples like Kulwant Singh as a lawyer. I mean, if you look at Kulwant Singh's case, it's a very good case. Kulwant Singh was a lawyer. He went to see a bibi at a police station. He took his baby and his wife, and then next he's murdered in a canal. And the whole of the legal community...
From home, was he?
He was basically arrested while in the police station. And he was, the whole of the legal community across Punjab and Haryana had to go on strike. This is like thousands of lawyers going on strike for 2 months so that the police would reveal the truth, because they'd concocted a case onto somebody else. So when you've got something like this happening, establishing of statistics is near impossible. But in terms of vicarious trauma, I think there is a lot of torture victims who basically have witnessed people being dragged away.
With such oppression and atrocities on such a vast scale, it's almost beyond belief that it's been kept under wraps for so long. How is that possible? How is it that the world has not seen this?
I think, quite honestly, it didn't help that we didn't have very strong community television and access and communications in the 90s.
Yeah, but the same could be said for the the Albanian massacres by the Turks.
I think what happens is, unfortunately, people get on with their lives.
Yeah.
And at some point, whether it's a sant or a lawyer gone missing, they become iconic. And so rather than people saying, and people in the diaspora, especially us being part of the diaspora,
absolutely, yeah,
we're thinking about our families or our friends or our networks. A lot of what I found with Sikhs, especially our community, is they rely only on their own network. They don't actually go out, and what we've tried to encourage people to do is not to contribute to our charity, but to actually go out and meet victims. I mean, Baji, we're Sikhs.
How simple is it to go out to India and find a victim?
It's very easy. In this post-genocidal era, I would say as Sikhs, it's our duty. 20 or 30 of our friends should actually be victims who are poor from the Punjab. And imagine that, if you had 20, 30 friends who were victims, I had, and the whole of Britain had.
What happens with me as a British Sikh, and the stories I hear about Punjab, doctors being mercenaries, well, the poor are no better. They're mercenaries as well. You hear people saying, so-and-so, fulana, has taken advantage of such and such, who's come from England. And the English guy hasn't got a clue, and he's been taken for a ride or whatever. Now, what happens if there's no organisational structure to introducing Western Sikhs or diasporic Sikhs to torture victims and their families in India, and we are encouraged to make direct contact with them? What happens if 5 individuals, all at separate times, approach the same family, and the family says, "Sanu kise ne nahi help kita"?
Well, Baji, you've hit the nail on the head. What has actually happened is, because the Sikhs have not managed to create their own internal coordination committee between different Banthak groups, between different NGOs and charities who are utilising victims in order to collect money, and because they've not been open about their lists, made lots of excuses, and most victims are quite open right now that they should be known and people should contact them directly. We have come across many instances of victims like Seva Singh. I'll give you an example. Seva Singh is an elderly person. He lost his wife, his 2 children, his nephew. He's in a little brick room, very destitute. And he said we were the first people who had even asked him if he was okay. So what you find is that the Sikhs will have to, as activists, they're going to have to go beyond their kotiyan. Because when we all go on holiday, everybody goes back to the Bind or back to their, and if you happen to come from the Dwaba region, then there is nothing going on there. But you go to, where's the nearest Domino pizza place, you matha take at Harmandir Sahib. But if you could just go a few miles further, if you could not just rely on one NGO, but rely on others who've been in the field for quite a few years, you'd be so surprised that you can reach a lot of people.
How do you liaise with those
need
people?
Help.
For the benefit of our viewers now, if, for example, I was going to go to, I know you're going to go to India. You will be in India by the time this is broadcast, to help with various issues that you're dealing with at the moment. But if I was, hypothetically, if I was going to go to India a month from now, what do you suggest how do I go about liaising with an NGO, and which NGOs? Are there sort of NGOs that are not quite as upfront as they should be?
I'm finding that most of the NGOs are not very upfront, because what they need to be upfront about is that getting priority help, as in matching people from here to victims over there, is the priority. And they're not opening up their lists. It's not published on the web. They're not having even internal committee meetings. And there's a lot of scaremongering around victims. Victims are in a very destitute state.
Are these Jathebandi-based NGOs?
These are individuals who've decided to provide aid globally, or various groups. But the whole point is this: they've not created systems or infrastructures. They've not created, for instance, when you have Oxfam has the head of Afghanistan and about 10 people underneath and
them, yeah.
as well as grassroots workers.
Yeah.
There's a huge structure. And what you'll find is that a lot of public relations is being done in Britain. So I would question if someone's sitting here for 24/7 and in the West, then what work is there being done for the poor? If that was your mum or my granny, would we really rely on somebody to get some help at some time, months into the future at some point? No, we wouldn't.
No.
The poor are our families. Jere elders, jinnah de bache who have passed away, they're our honour. And I was just talking just now to a human rights activist in India who also said this, said, how many poor can you help? And I said, no, they're our honour. It's our honour to find these people, because there's a lot of Sikhs, I'll tell you, there's a lot of victims who the Sikhs would refer to as Shaheed Parvars, who wouldn't even open their mouth to ask you for help right now. Because they have always believed in Maharaj the Hukam.
Yeah.
They have, and they haven't got onto the PR campaign of help us now, help us tonight, or the way in which a lot of poor are, end up having to do their own PR so somebody will listen to them.
Yeah.
They are gupt, and yet we haven't managed to reach people like that. I was quite appalled a few years ago, Baji. We did an cataract camp, which we've been trying to do every few months. And one Bazurg, he'd lost 3 members of his family. And he gave me a she-rod. I felt that was like priceless. That's the price of what Sikhs here would buy a designer handbag or a designer car.
Yeah.
And go to the Gurdwara to pray. I would say, why don't they pray a little bit less? Surely the prayer is, and it's our duty, every Sikh's duty. It's not just to do with the Jathebandiyan or someone who's set up a charity.
Final question. Of all the torture victims in Punjab, are all of them Sikhs?
Well, some of them, what we found was some were Christians and Hindus who also lost members of their families within the struggle. So, because it was a whole civil war, and
this is not an exclusively Sikh thing.
No, it's not exclusively Sikh.
It's a majority Sikh thing,
Sikh
of course,
thing,
yeah.
But not exclusively, because when, for instance, in the region where Tufan Singh, for instance, was a Karku at that time, and up against the police who were comprised of Gobind Ram and their appalling human rights atrocities. Tufan Singh, a researcher once told me, it was quite a few years ago he told me, but when Tufan Singh's funeral took place...
I've seen pictures of his funeral.
It's pictures, yeah, and it was, the fields were flooded, but what they were shocked was that a lot of people there were Hindus.
Yeah.
So at the end of the day, when you're up against a barbaric police force, does it really matter what colour your neighbour is? You're actually up against a barbaric police force, and this is what we'll find if we can do the due diligence work rather than wait and sort of say, oh good Lord, the Christians are going around doing propaganda, or somebody else is doing propaganda, converting. The whole idea of Dharam in a post-genocidal era would be not to look the other way. It would be that our Shan is going to be that you have 50 friends who are victims, I have 50 friends who are victims, and we're growing the network. We're not even staying at that. That's
brilliant. Do you know what? It's been inspirational.
Listening
to yourself, I wish you the best of luck.
Thank you
the future,
so much, buddy.
with this trip that's coming up now in India. Hopefully, when you come back from India, you can come back here and we'll have an update and see what the situation is live as per se. But otherwise, Simarjit Kaur, thank you very much for turning up today. I hope that was as informative for yourselves as it was for me. I know I've taken a lot from it today. I thank Simarjit Kaur from myself and the team at Sangat Television. Thank you for watching, and look forward to the next episode. Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh.